Hello and welcome to another episode of Pakistonomy. My name is Uzair, and today I have with me Dr. Hussain Nadim, who needs no introduction, but he is Executive Director at the Islamabad Policy Research Institute, leading their strategic communication and reform efforts. He is someone who has a lot of experience working within and outside the government on reforms, on trying to push through things, get the structures of government to innovate, to incentivize change and all of that. So I figured we would have him on here today, talk about why is it that it's so hard to reform things and change things within the structures of government in Pakistan, and how are things changing? Obviously, nothing is static. Things are improving in some ways, things aren't in others. So Dr. Saab, thank you for taking out the time and joining us here today.
My pleasure, Uzair. It's a real great privilege to be here and talking to you. Been following your work for some time, and always had the pleasure to talk to you as well, especially on
No,
WhatsApps.
likewise. And I want to start with, speaking of WhatsApp, maybe this is a good starting point that I want to get your view and talk about innovation and the use of data and policy overall, and why is it so hard to get this thing to change. I sent you this, like my friend Junaid Akram, who's a social media influencer, posted an Instagram story saying the government of Pakistan is still using faxes to send notifications. And he had a funny rant about it, but it is a very serious question that why are we still using faxes, and why is it that the larger point, which I want to get your views on, is why is it that when we know that there are reforms needed in national security issues, in the way the foreign office works, in the way the world has changed on economics, etc., we know a lot of that, but it is very hard to get these changes through the system in Pakistan. Why is that the case? Why is it so difficult?
You asked $1 million question, and I think Dr. Ishud Hussain has spent his lifetime working on this problem and then trying to implement the problems well. Would be good to also have him on the conversation. But on your friend's Junaid Akram's part, I think he's wrong on one part at least. Fax machines are definitely still used, but take a step back, and the file system with that Dory, that's still the most used form of communications internally within the government, and also when you have to send out a communication to anyone. So despite the fact that you may be using in email or WhatsApp, unless and until you don't put it on paper and circulate it in the file, it's not official. So we're still living in three parallel universes. One, the Dory system left by the British. So we have that. The other, integrated by the Americans through the Nortel and the fax machines. We retained that. And now we've also moved the entire government and public policy on WhatsApp. Yet all three structures, alhamdulillah, are very much intact and are being used parallel. So it's not that we've not changed. We've changed, but we've kept our comfort very much intact, so that in case if we fall or somehow there is a technological apocalypse, we still have the filing system intact. So that's there. So I would just want to reword how things work. So it's not that we're not giving up on old. It's not we're not moving ahead. We're moving ahead, but we're also keeping the past very much tightly intact to
So
us.
there's a PDF of circulated, but the PDF is a printed, scanned copy of a digital document, which is then circulated as a PDF.
Absolutely. So our entire communications and policies are, whenever we're developing that, it's literally out of some sort of insecurity or pessimism that technology itself may fail. So we need to keep our other options open that we're much comfortable with. So I think that when you ask this question about why are things not changing, for instance, or why things are moving really slow, it's because a government, as you probably already know, it's a huge machinery, uh, and the and and its willingness to change very fast is essentially the incentive to do that is not much there, because there is no real urgency to do that. The government does not operate in any sort of urgency that we have to do this and this and this, because primarily the mindset that goes into the government institutions and to the government policymakers is that anything you do in a haste or in a reaction is almost always going to be a problem. But then again, there is another problem as well, that if you do nothing at all, that's also a problem. So the right balance between the two worlds is essentially the problem. And sometimes I think we talk a lot about these reforms issues, why we're not doing it, whether there's a lack of political will or anything. I do believe there are structural issues involved with that. So when you have tenure systems which are essentially 2 years, or in some cases in policing, there are 6 months of tenure in the IG Punjab, which is the principal individual going to undertake reforms. How do you undertake reforms when you know that my maximum tenure is essentially 6 months? So politicization, I think, is a little bit more important thing. Lack of tenure and uncertainty is the reason why you won't find any appetite for a long-term strategic reform. So essentially what happens, and I'm sorry, I'm dragging this a little bit more, but essentially what happens is that anything that takes under 6 months is approved right away. But anything that will take above 6 months to 1 year is a maybe. And any strategic project which is above 3 years is definitely not. So in that, when you've categorized as a senior leadership or a senior management, the projects to be done in that particular context, then what you have is essentially a change that does not really happen in real time. So
that's super fascinating. Thank you for breaking it out that way, because there's a lack of urgency. Nothing over 6 months, or let's say time horizon of a year or over, is sort of fully approved and quickly moves through the system. But then at the same time, we see in government that there is a constant sort of crisis mode, right? And you and I have talked about this as well around national security, foreign policy. We see this in economic policy as well, in the sense that, all of a sudden, LNG ship needs repairs and we don't know what's going to happen, right? Or all of a sudden, we need to have a focal point person to talk about Pakistan's Afghanistan policy and not have 6 people talking 6 different things on the Stratcom side, right? They're all interlinked. So is that just an incentive issue? Is it a structural issue? Is there something as a low-hanging fruit that can be fixed to begin shifting Pakistan away from this constant crisis management mode cycle across institutions?
So, there are 2 sides on this specific issue, and we deliberate a lot. We deliberate a lot on this issue within the government sector and within the think tank as well. And there are 2 views on this thing. One view is essentially that the more you do, the more you try to fix, the worse is it going to get eventually. Because in attempts to fix a problem, which is probably is about something else, your wrong diagnosis ends up creating solutions which create more new problems. What I'm essentially saying is that you end up creating layers and layers of institutions. For instance, you realize, okay, so we have an Afghan problem, let's do this thing, develop a Afghan committee on this. Oh, this didn't work out, let's develop an APEX committee, let's develop a Stratcom committee. So you end up creating committees and essentially layers of institutions which are kind of creating more and more problem. So for instance, within the government, if you look at the previous and this one, the answer to every problem is not developing a committee on top of another committee, which then will fight with each other for role and influence. And this is one view. The other view is that since this is a matter of national security or urgency, we need to deliver. So let's just develop some running framework that can deliver quickly, and then we'll figure out what happens next. What happens between these 2 different thoughts process is essentially that the long-term strategic approach or the sustainability part of whether when we create something, how is it gonna, because in government, whenever you create a project, a development project, whether it is even, for instance, when I was working at the Planning Commission, there's one thing very interesting that I found out was that development is essentially has both losers and winners. So whenever you invest $60 million in a development in rural Sindh or in a Punjab, there are going to be a lot of poor people that are going to be benefiting it. But there are going to be many, many more communities that are going to have to face the impact, the marginalization. For instance, when you create a dam, there is a lot of IDPs involved in it. Whenever you're creating any development projects, the cost and the price you have to pay, they are always there. So within the context of the framework, and we're talking about the national security and the foreign policy and the strategic communications, we are fixing small problems while creating bigger problems. So that is the second view that is already there. So how I see it is essentially very simple. I think it's not really complicated. We have over 70 years of institutions. And if you predate it from the British Empire, they're coming from a very, very long history with a particular mindset and with a particular system of running the government. The goal was to eventually reform the institutions. You didn't reform the institutions, you tried to create small islands of successes which were related to individuals. So Shahbaz Sharif came, he delivered on ABCD project. He left, the system entirely collapsed because there was no sustainability to the structures. There was no empowerment of the bureaucracy that was working underneath. There were no runners on the ground that could hold on to that machinery. So I do think that the core issue is essentially about coordination on the strategic communications part. And specifically when you talk about the LNG and all of these issues, I've had the chance to work on some of these problems. The issue is not to do with any incompetence, or the issue is not really with any person trying to sabotage, or it's the political lack of political. The real issue is that, are the departments coordinated or not? And I'll just give you one more example on this issue. Throughout the year, we are doing national security business, this and that. Come first Feb, when we realize, oh, Kashmir Day is coming in the next 3, 4, 5 days. So the entire Stratcom starts 2 or 3 days before the Kashmir Day. Now, it's how the system has evolved, where it is so disorganized. Although we have a full Kashmir ministry, by the way, ministry that deals with the Kashmir issue, which is, I'm not sure what it does the whole year round. But on 1st February, everybody wakes up in Pakistan and realizes that we have to do something about the Kashmir. Lack of coordination and a lack of the machinery to actually continue to work year round, which is why when the LNG problem is not very different from the Kashmir problem, or the problem that we are facing maybe internally with TTP, all these different disparaging problems have something very much common. The denominator is very common, which is institutions that are very much disconnected to each other, and they're not speaking, partly because in a technological world where we live, they're still on the filing system, and that file takes time now. So I do think
but then it's not, it's from what you explained, coordination is obviously a big thing, but it's maybe a bit more than that, right? So if you have the Kashmir ministry, ideally the Kashmir ministry would have an entire 12-month calendar with, key dates on which, important issues need to be raised, people need to be coordinated. Coordinate for what is what I'm trying to get at. So are the ministries, are the institutions, in your view, doing that bare minimum at least, where they say, okay, over the next 6-month horizon, here are the key events that will happen, and therefore we need to make sure that, LNG's December demand goes peak, so in July we need new tenders, or Afghanistan, the refugee crisis is boiling over because Joe Biden has said he's withdrawing troops on August 31st. The announcement was made months ago, so we need the ministry and the folks who are in charge of dealing with the refugees who set up camps starting today, so that in 6 months from now, when there are tens of thousands of Afghans coming in from the border or flying in, everything is prepared. Do you think that bare minimum of actual work happens at the ministry level, or no? Is there an issue there as well?
You're absolutely right on that part. And I think, the answer is again the same in a way, and I'll articulate it in a different way. We only prepare food when we're hungry. So unless and until we don't feel the need, there is no appetite to do anything. For instance, the whole year round, there is no appetite within the government to talk about Kashmir at all. You see? So when come the month of February, then we start realizing, okay, Kashmir is now a problem, and that we need to start talking about it. So we've kind of like earmarked that specific month for this. And part of the reason is because the entire machinery itself is essentially in a state of emergency. It's in a state of constant one crisis after another crisis. So when you're so stuck in the crisis, you tend to not go to your immediate concern. I mean, you tend to only attend your immediate concerns, then thinking long-term strategic issues. I remember when I was with the previous government, there was petroleum crisis. With this government, it was the LNG crisis. And if you keep going back, you realize that these things are actually not new. They happen every single time with the different paces. So it's less to do with the politics on the top. It's more to do with the whole mindset of the political bureaucratic machinery that exists, where the boss is only going to be bothered about that particular issue in those particular months when it is needed. All other months, it's not really an issue because there are more important things going on. For instance, I'll give you one example. Right now, Pakistan's biggest, the entire Pakistan's focus is on the Afghanistan issue. There are 10 million different things happening, boiling around even on the Afghanistan issue, on the India issue, and the Kashmir issue, which we are really not talking about. Till we realize that, okay, that one is hurting now. So let's start talking about it. And I think this partly is not only restricted to Pakistan anymore. I study, actually, most of my work is on the US policy. And I realized that the strategic policy making in the United States has been dead for past 20 good odd years. Part of the reason is because they've also transformed from that mindset of developing very long strategic foreign policy making to now being engaged on the day-to-day basis on how to run a particular theater of war. And that, I think, is a direct result of what happened in Afghanistan. And I think this is, then again, I say that this is not the result of any specific agenda. It's just how technology has evolved to a point where the institutions are becoming redundant. The business as usual cannot survive the way it is trying to survive. So good model to actually look at is Australia. I mean, if you look at the Australian reform agenda and how they, and even Britain to a more or less extent, the way they're constantly changing their institutions and fixing, integrating, decluttering, streamlining, I think that's exactly how you develop a public service mechanism model or an interdepartmental coordination mechanism that actually delivers in the digital age. Unless and until you don't do that, then you'll have the LNG problem, then you have all sorts of problems as well, which the US is going to face because essentially the US is a very large machinery. And I mean, we love to talk about Pakistan, but the US itself is also very bureaucratic. I mean, I've never thought that any other country in the world apart from Pakistan would be that bureaucratic, but the US comes right at the top. So they're facing exactly the same problems as we are facing in many of the cases.
Yeah, and I think it's similar to, we don't have committees here, but you're absolutely right. There was a recent Foreign Affairs article or some other publication wrote about how even the National Security Council staff, from its very old core of the post-World War Soviet war era, when there was a big Cold War going on, was about 60, 70 people. It's ballooned to over 300 people now. And the addition, the 3x in personnel, is not that you have more regions of the world to look after anything. It's just layers of bureaucracy that are up. So now you have deputy principals committees and principal committees and then director level meetings. And all of that is basically moving files, not in the British format of Dory. But your point about like this being an issue, it's global. And I think the former Australian Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, I heard him say this once, was that the problem we're going to increasingly face is that 19th century ideologies with 20th century institutions are expected to solve 21st century challenges. And that's simply not going to happen, right? So we see this around the world in the sense that socialism or capitalism, parliamentary or presidential democracies, how does that work? And then constitutions that were written in the 18, 19, 20, early 20th century expected to help the world and a young population of the world deal with issues related to climate change, internal warfare, things like that. Is simply not going to happen. So I think that's where the reform agenda comes in.
That's very interesting part. And yeah, I love the quote you put out with Kevin Rudd. And this is one of the major problems when I'm talking to a lot of university students in Pakistan for the purpose of hiring or whenever I'm on social media. And I don't think I see it anywhere around the world. And I've had a chance to live, worked in England, Australia, in America, Canada. While the world is moving out of that post-ideological, I mean, from that very hardcore ideological era and moving towards more tech type of an identity driven by tech and the new economy, somehow or the other, our universities are now buzzing with Marxism and communism and liberalism. I frankly have no idea what it all means. Like literally no idea. But what in this day and age of TikTok, what is Marxism? I mean, I think you can reevaluate and you can do all of that. But if your universities are now producing, and I feel fear for Pakistan that if our universities are now producing Marxists and not entrepreneurs, technology entrepreneurs, there's a real divide and disconnect between what is being taught at the university level and what is actually out there in the market. And this is the problem that I face daily in my recruitment within the policy sector, is that the people that I'm hiring most of the times are not from this age in many ways. So you talk to them about AI or ML, or you talk to them about new technologies in the Silicon Valley. Okay, that's even too far-fetched. But even the basics about how tech is influencing national security, or how environment is influencing the governance. So they would have less idea about that. But that sort of activist kind of politics and governance, there is a lot of appetite for that. So those are some problems which I think, again, takes the debate in a very different direction, which is not really helpful in the policy side either. I feel that because there is no real pressure on the government to act, because the campuses where the real conversation needs to come out from, they're too busy in some very, very disconnected political activism. And the other day, Hussain Nadim from GW, he talked about this one very important fact, and I resonated a lot, that the intellectuals of our society, Pakistan, and he was talking about Iran as well, need to be the intellectuals of our own society, not intellectuals of the New York. So if you're raising the slogans and if you're raising the concerns of the global society or those that are pressing needs of the United States, in Pakistan, it may get you traction on Twitter. But in real terms, as somebody who sits in the policy, what benefit do I get out of your discourse at a university? So I think that disconnect is also very much there, which I think kind of makes government a lot more comfortable, knowing that there is no real person to provide.
I think there's a issue around modernization of ideas, right? I'm totally fine with somebody being a Marxist, but at least bring your Marxism into the 21st century. For example, if you are going to talk about Marxism in the 21st century, then perhaps you start with, on the policy side, perhaps you start with talking about who should own data. And does that translate into good data protection laws and things like that in the country? In a Pakistan where data literacy is a problem, where you don't know what telecoms are storing, where they're storing data, how are they keeping it secure, who has access to that, people's phone numbers get leaked, et cetera, et cetera. So you can have a Marxist worldview about it, but then bring it to the 21st century and say that the state should create policies that make the individual the owner of the data, not a corporation. Fair enough, let's have that debate. But you're absolutely right, we're not having those types of debates, and that's a problem. But speaking of the 21st century, one thing that we talked about advanced economies, and obviously they have access to a lot more data. In the US, you can go to the St. Louis Fed website, et cetera. You get a lot of data online, it's accessible. You can inform your policy through that. That type of data in a Pakistan type setting is very, very hard to get access to, not only for common citizens, but even for academics, people who are doing deep research. What's your view on what it takes to make policy more data driven versus policy that is dealing with crisis? And also to your point, right? Like in a bid to solve a problem, you're going to create more problems. The only way around it is using good data to inform your policy. How is that changing?
Okay, so here's the thing on this part. And I think we've had some discussions of this Zoom podcast as well on this. The British were here for a very long time, and the last time any serious data that was done of this region was by the British, the Imperial Gazettes. I'm not sure if you had a chance to look at them, but they're one of the most fascinating documents. Because
sorry to interrupt here, but since we talked about Afghanistan and you brought that up, when I was in grad school doing research on Pakistan's counterinsurgency doctrine, the most informative stuff was the Imperial Gazettes. They had documented the tribes, the sub-tribes, their views, their internal feuds, and there was nothing modern coming out of Pakistan that dealt or updated any of that stuff.
Absolutely. So you know then what I'm talking about. Those gazettes talked about every single aspect of every tribe in the entire region. The way British ruled, and this is what we were talking about initially as well, why the Americans failed, in this region and how the British, whatever they did, they were able to retain an empire, is because the first thing they did essentially in terms of governance in 1858 was to literally send out their people, the bureaucrats actually. The funny part is that they were the bureaucrats that did the entire data. So they were sent out and they did the entire study. Because if you need to govern a land, you need to first know what's on ground, what needs to be governed. The biggest failure of the American project in Afghanistan is that they went into Afghanistan without actually knowing the ground at all. So they didn't know what they wanted to govern, what the situation was. So everybody could literally fool them from A, B, C, D, and they were all ears. They would listen to everyone. I'm not going to go into detail of that, but coming back to the data part, the real data of this region has been done by the British. The problem then is that we've continued to use that data set to this day in the government of Pakistan and more or less in India as well. Now, if we are still using that data, which was a colonial project, which framed the communities, the societies in a particular way. For instance, this whole idea about the Bengalis as traitors, it doesn't come from anywhere else, but comes from the British.
Or the Pashtuns and the Punjabis as a martial race.
Martial race, the Pashtuns as the warrior class and all of that. They're not your own organic ideas. They're essentially framed by them. So your national policies and the dialogue and the communications is essentially built upon a particular worldview of the British Empire about you. So agreed, that happened, gone. But post-decolonization, the data had to be changed because you needed to go down, do an extensive study and all of that to change the way things were being done. Okay, that never happened. Move on forward. You still have the districts. You still have the British structures, the DMGs, the SHOs, the police station. I'm not sure how much you have researched on this part, but the police station, the SHO that was in the particular area was essentially the main area where everything was being done. So that was where the justice was being provided. That was also the prisoner. That was also the place where all the data was being collected. Everything was being done within the police office and the district office. Now, you do have the data. That's the fun part. Every district you go, you still have the data of every single possible thing. We have so much useless data that you cannot possibly even imagine. When I was working at the Planning Commission, we had so much data on possibly you can't even imagine on a subject, and we have data on that. The real problem starts. One, whether that data is accurate or not, because the people that now collect data are not as good as they used to be. Back in the 50s and the 60s, the quality of the data, the input, it was much better, much better supervised. And I blame a lot to the population explosion, the urbanization and all of that, which have changed that. But still, the quality of the data is one big problem. Second, the format of the data. So a lot of times the data I get or I receive, it's in a format where I will have to spend next 100 years to transform that data into something that I can use for analytics purposes. So we did a project, a very small project right now with Ministry of the Law and Justice about this woman harassment and all of that. And we've mapped out a little bit data on where the resource institutions are and all. And the real challenge was not that there was no data. The real challenge was that it was PDF copies. And to convert them into something which is more usable is what was most problematic. So the data is there. The accuracy, we can improve on that. The format definitely needs to be improved. The pipeline, the data pipelines need to be established into a centralized organization, which should be the Ministry of Statistics. Reform the Ministry of Statistics, develop data pipelines. It's literally a 6 months project with a proper investment. We don't really have to care about the accuracy right now. Let's forget about that. Develop the data pipelines, integrate the data into intelligible form, and then start working backwards to seeing how the numbers can be made more accurate. So my problem within the government is not the unavailability of data. My real big problem is how do I convert that data into analytics because of the format and other issues. Now, the reason I've explained to you is because of that, but then there are a lot more other reasons why that's not considered useful. And it will go back to my first point. You're a secretary in the government, posted in Ministry of Stats. First, you don't want to be there. Why would you want to be there? Second, more important part is now you're there. You first need to figure out, how do I get out of here? So your next 6 months are spent on getting out of there. If you're lucky, you get out of there. If you're not lucky, you sit over there and then you either figure out what I can do with this place, or you can figure out that, okay, I'm just going to sit out quietly while the minister sahab or anyone else feels that I've been punished enough. Now I can be put in somewhere else. So certain places are essentially made as a punishment ground, that if you're not happy with someone, send it to Ministry of Stats or anywhere else. So as long as that kind of mindset prevails and there is a tenure which is 6 months or a year or 2 years, these type of projects take a long time. So you essentially need some people that can turn over the institutions, and that needs to come from the top eventually. You can't really just have some grade 19 or 20 bureaucrat who can undertake that, because the chain of command does not allow you to do that. So if I'm a grade 19 or 20 officer who's very much positive and optimistic, I'll develop a project, I'll send it over to my boss, and he realizes, okay, fine, this is going to take 2 years or 3 years, to hell with it. I'm not going to do that because I will not be here to do so. So I think these are some really problematic things that can be changed, but not by changing the things that we think are need to be changed, by changing those things that go under the radar, but those are actually the real issues involved over here.
Yeah, it's almost like, you can buy the nicest plants and put them, but if the soil underneath is acidic, the plant is eventually going to die no matter how much you take care of it, right? So you have to dig in and like reframe a lot of things that are there. But you worked with the previous government, you've been working with this government, like what are some things that excite you in terms of, you look at and say, you know what, okay, there's a lot of problems. We always talk about problems. There's a lot to change, and everywhere, not just Pakistan, not unique in that sense. Many countries have to deal with a lot of these challenges and are continuing to deal with a lot of challenges. What are some things that you think have improved over the years that perhaps sort of are something we should talk about more and say, you know what, like things can get done? For example, like you talk about crisis management, right? And we get a lot wrong in crisis management. But when I look at NCOC, and what NCOC has been able to achieve in a pandemic and under so much stress, it's amazing, right? Now, is that the template for other issues? Perhaps not, because we're in a pandemic and this was specifically deal with the pandemic. But I look at that as a success story that shows when the government of Pakistan puts its mind to it, it can get stuff done. What are some other things that you look at and say, you know what, things are getting done?
It's a very interesting thing, and I have a very different way to look at it. And I think I kind of, last 2 years back, I wrote an article on this specific subject as well. What happened with the NCOC, and you know me very well. I was always very optimistic about the government being able to do that. And I'm trolled for being too optimistic on social media as well. That's exactly how I am. But here is the thing. What happened with NCOC is not an accident. People think that we got lucky. It's not true at all. You don't get lucky. I mean, as long as fine, India was not under India didn't face what it faced, you could have said that Desis are getting lucky. But when Punjab on that side and Punjab on this side were showing completely different numbers, it was not an accident. So one thing I want to make sure that this was not an accident. But what really happened then? Here's a very interesting part. The way Pakistan has evolved in the last 70 years, this country has been in a state of crisis, one after the other, which essentially means that our institutions operate only during the crisis. Our institutions don't operate otherwise at all. MOFA, and with all due respect to my MOFA friends, I really love you all, but here is one.
That's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, for those who may not know the acronym.
Ministry of Foreign Affairs gets a lot of heat all year round. The way Ministry of Foreign Affairs has operated in the last 3 weeks of Afghanistan, it is mind-blowing. The bravery they've exhibited, I've had friends over there, I've had to evacuate a lot of people. 2 hours and they were issuing visas. 24 hours around the clock, they have delivered the best that any country has done in the 3 weeks. Why? And somebody at MOFA told me that we operate best under crisis. But that's not only MOFA, that's the entire country. That's the nature of our countries. We are like a sleeping lion. We only wake up when there is a sort of crisis. And that's exactly what happened with the NCOC. Why Pakistan was able to operate the best, better than any other country in the world, in my opinion, is except for those countries that had a smaller population and that didn't hit. Pakistan's institutions are essentially made in a way and they're trained in a way wired to operate only in the times of crisis. So when the crises are gone, these institutions are going to go back to their shell and do exactly what they were doing, which is nothing. But when the crisis happened, the way they were able to mobilize and integrate with each other, the military connection, because a lot of people were blaming, I remember at that time, oh, military did this, military. The whole idea of civil and military, which has been a big problem for Pakistan in 50 million things, but it really worked in this corner because the NDMA and the military has dealt with these situations when it came to the floods and other situations, and they had integration with the civilian authority on how to manage the crisis in when it comes to handling the crowd and this and that. On top of that, you had a prime minister, which refused to, and I have to give him credit on that, which refused to budge on Twitter criticism. Because when everybody was saying that do this and do that, I think his idea on using some level of data to make the decisions, and the prime minister and other people as well, I think that was very, very good. I remember back in the days I was running the Nerve Center, we were daily providing data to the government of Punjab and to the federal government on this. And there were other people as well that were doing data, providing data. And I do know for a fact that the entire decision making was essentially being done on data. And the crisis management and the response, it was as if they were trained to do this thing. The comfort that was there, the lack of panic and all, it appeared that it was there. So I do think that the crisis, the reason why NCOC was a success, or I do think, and I hope COVID remains to be not a big problem for us, but I do think that this country has been able to perform very much there because it's because these guys know how to perform in that. My only hope is that they're able to do that under non-crisis times as well. So similar with if I've given you two case studies, the NCOC and the Afghan crisis right now, both of them done in a way where you look at the United States right now, the biggest empire could not even, let alone could not even do the right evacuation, had no plans at all. On our side, the plannings were already there, the systems were in place, and these guys were ready to just press the button and get things out of there. So I think that explains to you why there was a success. But then again, it's good and it's bad both.
Yeah, I think kudos to everyone involved. Like I think last at IPRI only put it out, over 10,000 people have been evacuated through these efforts. So these are people have performed heroically, right, to save lives, get people to safety. And it is something we should celebrate. And speaking of, I think you're absolutely right. It's a very national thing. I don't think it's as restricted to government. Like, you know, those of us who are cricket fans know this from our cricket team. It entered the state of hal, right? As Usman Samiuddin has written so beautifully and poetically, is that all of a sudden you will see a Pakistan team enter a state of hal. And when it's in a state of hal, there is no beating it but then that state of hal is a very rare occurrence and it doesn't happen when you need it most at times as well. So it is one of those things. It is a strength, but I think like it is something that perhaps at some level, if we encourage that to become more institutionalized and say, look, you can perform at this pace when it's not even a crisis, maybe things improve. I'm mindful of time. So the one last question or two last questions I had for you was, from your point of view, given everything that's happened in the last 6 months, the situation in Afghanistan is very fluid. Obviously, the US is out, the core diplomatic staff has left, the soldiers have left. There is some leverage still that Washington has, but you know, other regions, countries in the region, etc., will play an increasing role. What risks do you see to Pakistan given the fluidity of the situation in Afghanistan, and where do you see things going in the next 6, 7, 8 months?
It's very hard to predict anything at the moment because I do believe there is an actual reality, and then there is this what goes on Twitter. So it's very hard to distinguish between what is real and what is not real. Even the statements that come out are with such a spin that sometimes we don't know. And then there is a bias. For the last 20 years, we're made to believe in certain terminologies, the definitions, and some ideas about the other, on seeing them as particular way. And I'm not just talking about Taliban, I'm talking about America, I'm talking about all sorts of groups that are involved, including Pakistan. So we need to separate all these different things. I'll speak specifically from the let's begin. I'll speak from the global perspective on what the challenges may be there for the global society. It's a repeat, past as a prologue. And you see, and I'll take you back to one specific statement. US National Security Strategy 2002, right after 9/11. The first thing they said essentially was that United States and the international society are not only under threat from the big powers. That was a Cold War thing. The non-state actors in underdeveloped countries, the fragile, the failed states, and all of that, they pose as much as of a threat. So they tied the insecurities and poverty in these parts of the world to the security and stability of the West. Now, while on the paper that was a really good idea, that somehow we need to bring security, stability, and good life in all across the world, unless we don't do that, we're always in security. That also created a sort of linkage between two things that probably were not linked at all. So the poverty in one part of the world, in Ethiopia, never really posed a threat to the United States. What this linkage actually missed was this idea that the places that had US involvement, the destabilization or the national interest, it was those places that posed a threat because of the grievances, the Palestine issue, then the Middle Eastern problems, and the South Asia and Afghanistan, where there was a previous involvement of the United States in one or the other form, they posed a danger. So what is happening right now? I personally, for one, don't think that it's over for the United States. It's not, because US may have been embarrassed, may have been humiliated, it's gone out. But if the goal was to eventually, make America secure from attacks and all of that, future attacks, the Al-Qaeda is gone. Most of the world's terrorist network operators and all of that, that's more or less gone. ISKP is there and all, which I do believe that is can be managed and easily handled. But if the real goal was winning hearts and minds and stabilize, hearts and minds start right now. The timing of heart and mind back into 2007 and 2015 was not there. You can't win hearts and minds by bombing people on the side. It's impossible. The US tried doing that. Hearts and mind project should start right very now. Part of the reason why I say that is because you have one group in Afghanistan, whether we like it or not, Taliban is a reality over there. The Americans have accepted them. You need to engage with the Afghan people. Forget about Taliban. Engage with the Afghan people. Go directly to the ground, engage with them, develop resilience of the communities, the society, and try to play a positive role that was needed to be played. More closer engagement with the Afghan people will allow better stabilization of the region, which the Russians will be on board with, which the Chinese will be on board with, which Pakistan will be on board, so to avoid a sort of civil war taking up place. Right now, the biggest threat is that if Taliban or whatever the government that will be there, what we want essentially is an inclusive government. Whatever government forms, if it does not get a signal of, recognition, legitimacy and all, there will be within Taliban, within Afghan society, small extremist groups that are going to continue to strike at will, which will continue to destabilize the region. And that is where you don't want to go, because the proxies that are operating in that part of the region can only be defeated if the international actors are responsible in their engagement with the Afghan people. So that has to be there, and America still has to play the largest role. From Pakistan's perspective, things are rather more tricky, because for the last 20 years in Afghanistan, we've tried to play a good part in whatever way was possible. We get a lot of blame for that, rightly so in many ways, exaggerated in a lot other ways. But for the last 8 years specifically, the Ghani government went on a very strong dose of ethnic and racial tensions, igniting that within Pakistan and Afghanistan. I don't know why that was the case. So that happened. So a lot of people are saying that Pakistan is celebrating Taliban's victory. That's the worst possible idea that I've seen. And I've talked to a lot of my American friends as well. Nobody in Pakistan is celebrating at the policy level or at the national level. There is no celebrations. Yes, there are pockets. In Peshawar, there are there. We saw the videos. In Quetta, there are there. There are millions of Afghan refugees born and raised over here. There are many of them embedded in the society, carrying ID cards from Pakistan, which we've treated as our own people. So a lot of them are also happy with the situation where there is a government that is going down. Pakistan's main interest, why many people over here felt that there is a relief, is not because somehow the country was happy about Taliban victory or country was happy about the American fall from grace or anything. It was only one thing, that for 20 years we've talked about that military solution is not the way around. And now finally some level of political solution can be done. That was the only thing, and which a stability may come in at some later point. So that was that interest.
Can I push you on that last point? Pakistan has argued, and you're right, from policy perspective, military solution is not the path forward. But the Taliban have pushed a political solution through military means. It is a military-led solution that they've achieved there, no?
Of course, but it was under an occupation, right? Their supposed home country was under an occupation. So what are they supposed to do? They can't talk politics and I mean, so there are two partners there. There are two actors. One is the United States, one is Taliban. Both of them believe in one thing: fight and talk. Fight and talk. That's what they've been doing for the last 8 years. For Pakistan, it was always talk and talk, because the more fight and talk was there, the more problem was for Pakistan because of this constant do more and then people coming forward and back and forth from a very porous border. So both Americans and the Taliban operated in the same way, that they wanted to fight a little bit. They also wanted to talk a little bit. And for the last 2 years or so, at least, the Americans kind of realized that, okay, we need to give space to them. And that's exactly how I think they've given space. And for Pakistan, I think the real problem starts where the concern is that Pakistan does not want to be left alone by the international community, taking all the burden of blame and responsibility to now ensure that Afghanistan is safe. We have a particular leverage in Afghanistan. The United States have a very huge leverage over Taliban at the moment as we speak. The Taliban wants to talk to the US, not just talk, they want to go to Davos. They also want to attend UNGA and all of that. So the Americans have a lot of leverage over them. For our side, the leverage isn't as much as people think it is, or it was used to be, in my opinion, which is why I think the problem from our side is that the more instability that arises over there because of the lack of international engagement with Afghanistan, the more, it's not just a refugee problem that there are going to be 1 million more refugees. We're already hosting 3 million. I'm sure a 1 million will not really add to a problem, but who are the people that come in? Whether they are TTPs, whether there are those that want to destabilize the region, whether there are going to be more attacks. What if there is an attack on the US embassy in Islamabad? What if there is an attack on anywhere else, on a cricket team? What do we do then? So I think those are concerns which are very real for us, and we don't want the international society to abandon Afghanistan the way it did last time, which created a whole problem. So for us, the talking points are exactly the same. You need to secure the world, talk to the Afghan people, the women, the minorities, talk to everyone, talk to Taliban, talk to Stanagazais, talk to Masouds, but talk to everyone and be the foreperson in that. The last time what happened was that, I mean, I remember in the 1990s when the Cold War ended and everything ended, it was, I think, the George Bush, the senior Bush, to whom the budget for Afghanistan went, and I think it was $50 million or $5 million that were asked for an aid, and he refused. He said that I'm not interested. So spending like $1 billion or $2 billion in Afghanistan, and they were not ready to give even $5 or $50 million to Afghanistan. That's the mistake that should not be repeated. I'm very, very happy that the last two tweets by US Secretary of State are very positive on that side, that they want to keep an engagement with Afghanistan. And if that's there, I do think there is a very positive impact that Afghanistan will create. And in the long run, I think, I personally, and this is not any state official view, that the Taliban wants to work with the international community and whatever the government. So
yeah, and I think I agree with you that there's a lot of leverage here. And I think even from a very Machiavellian point of view of where the US internally is, or where Western Europe internally is, right? A couple of billion a year in terms of projects on the ground is a far better outcome than a collapsing Afghanistan, where tens of thousands of more Afghan refugees want to get to Greece or have to fly via Doha to America. In an election year that's coming up, 2022, here in Washington, D.C., that's the last thing that the Biden administration would want is border crisis in Texas or towards the state of Texas from coming from Latin America, and a need to increase the number of refugee applications that need to be accepted, because Afghanistan is a place where many more thousands of people want to leave, and they have a due right to leave because they have worked with the United States in the past. And so rather than deal with that political problem domestically, it is far better for the Germans and the French and the Americans and everybody else to sort of say, you know what, like, you have won, and there's leverage here in the sense that this money is needed to stabilize. And if the Taliban don't get access to that money, then they have a protracted another 10 years, 5 years, who knows how many long years of war, which would be terrible for everybody, especially the countries around, especially for Afghans and the countries around Afghanistan. So let's see where that goes.
My fear in that part, and here is where it comes to the implementation side of things. I mean, intentionally, I can assure you one thing, and I'm pretty sure talking to my friends in the US, they have their heart and mind in the right place. They know exactly what needs to be done. Can they do it? That's a real problem, because even if the United States try right now to delist Taliban from the terror list, the Haqqani network or whatever, whoever they are, and try to unfreeze that money and try to dole it out, it will take at least 8 to 9 months because of the bureaucratic work and all of that. Sometimes I feel the situations get worse on ground, not because there's an intention to it, but because the bureaucratic channels and the way to process that, my fear is really that the time may run out. We don't have years over here. We can't wait for processes to work for 9 months and all. The US democracy needs to act really quick in terms of providing the funds that are needed to the Afghan people on ground for their lives to stabilize. If they don't want refugees, and I'm actually disappointed in the fact that it all comes down to 20 years of war, and all the Western societies are talking really about is that you keep the refugees over there. That's all. So, I mean, that's a talk for a different time though. But in Pakistan, you'll be surprised that anyone you talk to in the policy sector and all, apart from the statements on the top, no one is really reluctant to the idea of the refugees. The only concern is that, okay, fine, we don't want any guys coming and blowing themselves up, but there are 3 million refugees, we can host a million more as well. So there is no domestic politics going on between PMLN, PPP, and PTI over it. Instead, there is a lot of politics going on over there, and that's their only demand, which is sad. Yet we say that, fine, if that is there, throw in a $5 billion, and let's try to find a way to make sure that people in Afghanistan don't really have to leave. And I'm pretty sure that refugees, whoever is trying to run, are really not interested to run from a place. It's this crisis that make them, and the uncertainty which makes them run. The whole entire scenario on the Kabul airport, you know what exactly happened? So my friends in Afghanistan, specifically in Kabul, told me that the first time there was those crises at the Kabul airport, it was triggered by a TikTok video that somebody went viral in Kabul, and he created a TikTok that the US is essentially brought the jets and everybody is now allowed to go. Whoever wants to get out can get out. And there were video going around viral. And I know a lot of my friends that said that everybody just went about and started running to the airport with their bags and everything, that this is probably a way to get out of the country, whether they have a problem or not. The Taliban was confused as to what exactly happened, because it's not even the United States. I mean, it created a panic, but the real panic created by someone talking about a video on a TikTok, and it just created a sort of panic where everybody was running to the airport. Now, how do you make sure that the people in Afghanistan feel secure and stable, that they stay in Afghanistan? And the only way to do that is to develop some faith and trust that whatever the new setup that may emerge, and I'm not saying that just to say that give a stamp of credibility to Taliban and say that go ahead with your version of whatever you want to do. No. You scale it back you put out your demands that for you to get this, and this needs to be done, and negotiate from that point of view. And America still has a huge leverage to be able to undertake that. And I think the Taliban will still dance to the tunes
Yeah.
because it really needs
And
that. It cannot survive for more than 2 months. And I can put it down on paper. 2 months is the max that they can survive without the entire credibility. They don't have the money to run the government.
yeah, I think the first thing that, I mean, I agree, like the file moving will take a bit of long time for additional funds. But if there is a political sort of, settlement in Kabul that is seem to be inclusive, then at least the 9 billion or so that have been frozen in reserves will get unlocked. That is a big thing that can happen immediately. So that's good. And to your point on refugees, the sad irony of this whole situation is that Western countries who are far richer and have far more resources are the ones complaining, whereas countries like Pakistan, Bangladesh, Lebanon, Jordan, and others who are far poorer, have far more capacity constraints, have hosted millions of refugees across borders for decades, if not more. That people that have come primarily due to conflict stoked by Western countries over the years. So that is the tragic irony of history. But before I let you go, this has been a fascinating conversation. And I always ask my guests 2 or 3 book recommendations for listeners. So, what are 2 or 3 books that you would recommend people pick up and read?
Oh, so one, I think more than the books, I'll just comment on one part. It's not how many, one thing I want to make sure on that. It's not how many books are you reading in a year, because I do know there are a lot of videos I see on social media that read 50 books a day. Like there's a new app to read books. Read one book, but read it in such a detail that you actually learn something out of it. So, and choose very wisely what you read, because I do think that there is a lot of published material which is so problematic that it's not suitable for reading purposes. Uh, there is a lot of stuff that I read on many different areas. Uh, I don't know where to actually start. I mean, on politics or
Any
on
topic, just pick something that you think had deeply influenced you over time.
so in different phases of life, you're experienced by you get inspired by different sorts of book. I think Conference of the Birds, Fariduddin Attar's original handbook on Sufism, the most inspiring because it allows you to understand how to think. That's one very, very important book. I do think that's one should read that. In the latest, I think on the more recent side of things, the the Power of Tragedy. That's, I think, very, very important book. And The Art of Super Deductions. I'm recommending most of those books because I feel that those are those books that actually help you to develop a capacity to read books in the right way. In terms of the subject matter, I think on Afghanistan, uh, I would definitely recommend Afghanistan. On Pakistan is the book by Bruce Riedel, the Armageddon. Forgetting the whole title of it. So that was really good. Directorate X and Ghost was both by Steve Coll. I would definitely recommend on Afghanistan. On Pakistan, I don't recommend reading any book at all, partly because I think most of the stuff that is written is not one of the best that I've read. I do think that Dan Markey at Johns Hopkins, very good. Even some work by Christine Fair. She's her work, academic work, is actually pretty good.
It's excellent. I think her book "Fighting to the End" was
So
excellent. So must
her
read.
research book, I do think that one should read that. Despite of her views and all of that, I don't know what's up with her on Twitter, but I do think her academic work is definitely worth a read. And I so on Pakistan, I think that work is important. Uh, Apart from that, I think yeah, more or
I
less.
think that's a lot. That's a great set of recommendations. So I think we covered a lot of ground on these, and
And yeah,
I agree.
and avoid reading and developing analysis through people's tweets.
That that
Sometimes
is that is super true. I think
sometimes
you
people are
can.
much better in real life than they are on Twitter. most of
Or
the
their
time.
academic work, right? Like Christine Fair's academic work is of excellent quality and it's a must read for anyone who's trying to study Pakistan. But if you develop an opinion or analysis out of her tweets,
That's
then
a
you will go
really
down the wrong way.
in the last minute, because I think I have to move on as well. This is a really sad part, and I think this is a conversation for another time on how social media has essentially reduced the conversation to 140 characters and to a point where we start judging the people through their Twitter. But then again, I don't know whose responsibility it is. If you're an academic, then perhaps tweet like an academic, but then there is no pressure to do that. But a lot of writers I know personally who are very critical on Pakistan, even Aisha Siddiqa, her book Military Incorporation and all of that, were very fascinating work, good insights and all. But somehow or the other, when you become a Twitter activist and you have to comment on every single thing, and here is what I believe: as an academic, I think you're not supposed to have a comment on everything or an opinion on everything. When a scholar starts having an opinion on every single thing, then I'm not sure if uh, the real opinions matter either, because you become tainted with a particular set. So I think a wise guy like the old times, they need to speak seldom and very wisely. So let the trolls do their job, and you only say the stuff that I think is more appropriate to your work, and which also keeps you relevant. Which is one of the reasons I think a lot of time academics keep complaining and scholars that why are we constantly getting trolled. It's probably because maybe we are saying too much, and we need to say only on so much which reflects some level of depth and analysis. Otherwise, people don't take us seriously.
Yeah, I think as my grandfather, may God rest his soul, used to say that in a room, the quietest person is often the smartest one because they're absorbing more and talking less. So I think that same rule should apply for Twitter as well. But Dr. Hussain, thank you so much for taking out the time. This was a wonderful conversation. I think we'll have you again on the podcast to talk about social media and its impact as well, because there's a lot to discuss there. But again, thank you so much for taking out the time.
My absolute pleasure is there, and thank you so much for inviting me over.
Take care.